Plant Protection, I would like to thank Professor Ingo Grass for becoming our guest speaker for this lecture. And I would like to welcome Professor Ingo here. It is our pleasure to have you as our guest speaker for today's webinar. And this Department of Plant Protection, the participants so far from the list that we have consist of both the graduate students and also undergraduate students, consisting from the plant protection, the entomology, plant pathology, forestry, environmental science, and rural PWD. I don't quite know what the English is, but it has something to do with rural development. So allow me to read Professor Ingo Grass' CV. So Professor Ingo Grass is a professor at the University of Hohenheim, and he is a professor of ecology, ecology of tropical agricultural system. His education was from the University of Marburg, and also, the University of Marburg from the undergraduate and also PhD. And the PhD is in conservation ecology, while the master's is in biology. His skill is pollination, biodiversity and conservation, agroecology, entomology, and community ecology, quite a wide arrays of expertise. He has vast research experiences in many areas in the world, and one of which is actually my counterpart in the CRC Jambi efforts project. And here, let me read a list of research experience starting from the 2016 to 2019 of a Volkswagen Foundation and Lower Saxonian Ministry of Science and Culture in diversity turn in land use science. And then also for the CRC 990, ecological and socio-economic functions of tropical lowland rainforest transformation system. And then the socio-ecological systems in the Indian rural-urban interface. Very, very interesting research experience in many parts of the world. So it is a pleasure to welcome Professor Ingo in this occasion, and I would like to ask Professor Ingo to present a presentation for 1 hour, and then it will be followed by question session, and the students, and not only students, but there are also faculty members and people maybe from outside of the IPB can also welcome for questions. So let us provide the opportunity now for Professor Ingo to present his presentation. Professor Ingo.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, first of all, for the very nice introduction, Ibu Dami, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. It's quite an honor. It's very nice to see so many people online and joining. And as Budami said, if you have any questions, maybe just interrupt me, or ask your question into the chat, or take a note so we can discuss it later on. So I'm very much looking forward to today's seminar together with you, and also to any questions or any comments you may also have on what I'm going to say. So let me share my screen with you so you can see my presentation. Okay, I hope you can see it in full screen. Is that working? Yeah, you can see it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Thank you. Okay, so I gave my presentation this very general topic, biodiversity and ecosystem services management in tropical agricultural landscapes. So this is also what my research is about. So I'm trying to understand how in these nice landscapes, like on this picture here in Madagascar, how biodiversity is responding to land use, how we humans interfere with biodiversity, but also how we can use biodiversity also, for instance, for our agricultural systems. So for instance, how we can use the biodiversity from the surrounding forests here to maybe provide ecosystem services to this rice agriculture system here, for instance, pest control of rice pest species, moderated then by species living in the agricultural landscape in the surroundings of these rice paddies. And for now coming slides, I want to talk a bit about how we can maintain biodiversity and also how we can maintain ecosystem services, and how maybe we can also come to better solutions. Because you all know that biodiversity is declining. You all know that our agricultural landscapes are changing quite a lot, and that we need to come up with some solutions to stop this biodiversity decline. Of course, there's also reasons for this. I think you are all very familiar with these kind of figures. You all know that the world population is growing, and it's growing still quite a lot. Maybe this will slow down in the second half of the 21st century. So there's different projections for how the world population will grow in the next coming decades. But for now, still, we can be very sure that there is a rising number of people on our planet. And this means also that by 2050, there will be about almost 10 billion people living on Earth. And considering that we have this population growth, but also there's also an increasing demand, and there's also increasing consumption of agricultural products, and also of those that take up a lot of land also as well. We will need to produce on average 70% more food by 2050. So this is quite a massive challenge. You know that already now it's hard to feed the world population, but by 2050 the challenge will be even more daunting than it is today. On the other hand, we have already transformed our planet quite a lot. So as of today, there is about 75%, so 3/4 of the ice-free terrestrial surface, so the tropics, the temperate zone, everything but Antarctica has been moderately or highly transformed by humans. So this can look like on this picture here with this kind of deforestation or slash and burn deforestation. But of course, also many other parts of the world, humans have significantly changed how Earth's surface is looking. And this, of course, has consequences for biodiversity as well as for the ecosystem services that we derive from biodiversity. There's also other trends. You all know also these kind of graphs here. So this is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere of planet Earth. And what we can basically see is when we look back in time, so about 400,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago, and then today, we can see that this has been always like a bit like a cycle going up and down. But all in all, we have never crossed this line here. Yeah, so we've always been below this kind of 300 parts per million when it comes to this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And now what we see now in the 20th century is we see this steep rise in carbon dioxide. And this is, of course, also related to all these changes in the past century in terms of population growth, in terms of development and so forth. And we are on track to really something new that has never happened before. And it's very hard to know actually what will happen with these new climate change going on. There's also other things going on. So again, something I think which is even more familiar to you than to me. So I'm right now sitting here in my room in a village with about 400 people. So a very small village actually. But you all know that even today, many people are living in cities. And again, by 2050, it's predicted that about 64% of the developing world and 86% of the developed world will live in cities. So basically, all of us will be living in cities soon. And this also means that somehow we humans, we tend to separate more and more from nature. So by living in these kind of cities, of course, the nature and the natural landscapes and also the agricultural landscapes, they all become more and more separated from us. And I think this can also cause problems because we tend to forget how nature works when we are only staying in the city. Then there is one last point I want to make, or actually two last points, and these are more about agriculture. So this one here, I'm actually not going to talk too much about, but you should be aware that livestock and the animal industry is actually quite a big portion of agriculture globally, and it's also very important. But in my presentation today, I'm mainly going to talk about crops, but always bear in mind, animals are also super important. And here the main problem is really that today there is so much livestock. There are so many animals that we humans eat, and they take up so much of the land, yeah, like almost 80% of the agricultural land, and they also emit a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, but they make up only a very small part of our calories. Yeah, so because we are eating very high up in the food chain, actually we have a very, very large impact on agricultural land. And this becomes also quite prominent in this figure here. So what you see here in blue, this is the biomass of all the livestock, so cattle and pigs and others. And in red color, we have the biomass of all the humans on planet Earth. And then we have the biomass of all the remaining mammals. So in this green portion, this very tiny green portion here, you have all the remaining mammals like elephants, tigers, and so forth. So only a very small part remaining. And I think this is quite shocking, actually, how large the livestock part here actually is. And of course, also our portion is also quite big as well. This is the last of these introductory slides I would like to show, and now highlighting more the croplands. This picture here is not from Indonesia, it's also not even from the tropics, but it's from the United States of America, where you have these big monocultures of soybean and maize and so forth. But of course, the problem is also existing in the tropics as well. And this is about the way we do agriculture nowadays with these kind of very intensive modern industrial systems, and also increasingly in Indonesia, but also in other tropical countries of the world, agriculture is more and more going into this direction. So it's more and more about intensification, having larger areas of land, using more machinery instead of manual labor. But the problem with this is that this is all based on finite resources. So it's all using a lot of oil, water, land, and also nutrients, which are all in some way limited and not endlessly available. You also see these big problems with soil erosion and pollution. And then there's even effects of agriculture also on other parts of our planet. For instance, a lot of the nutrients nowadays from agriculture, they go into our water, they pollute our groundwater, but they also pollute our oceans. And thereby they can lead to vast dead zones where there are no fish anymore. And then last but not least, we see all these effects on biodiversity. We also see the effects on global warming. But what we also see is that there's an increasing lack of knowledge of farmers because they rely more and more on these technologies. They tend to forget their traditional knowledge in part. And they also depend more and more on a smaller amount and sets of seeds and crops, and thereby also on companies. So also the relation of farmers and companies is also changing somewhat. So this is all a bit going into the direction, yeah, we can improve food production, we can produce more, but it all comes at very great costs to biodiversity, to nature, but even to us humans in the long term. And we see these changes also in the tropics, where we see these expansion and intensification, like these monocultural systems that you see nowadays all over the world, not only oil palm, but also soybean, even maize production, and thereby also an increasing competition for land between nature and agriculture. And this comes at the great cost of biodiversity. It also comes at what we call functional diversity. So species of different functions like pollinators, or also species feeding on pest species. And it comes then at the cost of these ecosystem functions and services on which actually our well-being also relies, like generating clean air, having clean water, having also pollination for our crops and so forth. We also tend to lose these services in the long term. Now, when thinking about agricultural systems, there is different perspectives. And if you open up a textbook maybe like this one here, it's called Agroecology, then you may have one of these figures in the very beginning. So here we have this rice plant here, and the rice plant, people are worrying about its growth, its development, its crop yield. And the crop yield is somehow related to abiotic drivers like the amount of light or nutrients and soil conditions, and also in some way to some biotic drivers, like for instance, insects feeding on the crops, so these phytophages here, or the antagonists of the phytophages. So this would be, for instance, parasitoids of the insects feeding on the crop. Yeah, and then in addition to this environment, we have what the farmer can do, and the farmer can, for instance, irrigate or fertilize or cultivate the soil, or he or she can also take care about plant protection or promote even those antagonistic parasitoids of the crop pest. So it's a very focused perspective on the crop plant, and I think this is also fine, but I think it's also a bit limited. Yeah, because it's only taking the crop plant into consideration, but not really everything else that is surrounding the crop plant. And in my presentation today, I would actually try to rather take you a bit on a journey of different perspectives on this, taking more of what I would call a modern perspective, so a change, because I want to convince you that it's not only about the crop plant, which we have here in our center of this landscape here, but it's also about the surrounding landscape. This is now more a drawing of a landscape which I'm actually right now in, so more of a temperate landscape with all these fields and hedgerows. But actually, this kind of landscape, with a bit difference, actually could also be in the tropics. And the things I'm going to talk about, yeah, they also are valid in the temperate zone as well as in the tropics. And there's different points I want to make today, and where we should actually focus on and what we should actually think about when we want to manage for biodiversity and manage for these ecosystem services in agricultural landscapes. So the first one I already said a bit about. So this is this local scale, the rice plant. And yeah, we need to consider, how do we do local management? How does our local management, like the crop that we're growing, but also the fertilizers that we're using, how does it affect the crop, but also the biodiversity? There's also things like organic and conventional agriculture. I'm not going much into detail there, but if you're interested in this, feel free to ask me later. And then we always talk about this plant and associated biodiversity. So plant actually means this is what the farmer is planning. So the crop that you are growing, this is what you plan. But in nature, you cannot plan everything, but there's always things coming also onto your farm. For instance, other organisms that interact with your crop. And this is what we call the associated biodiversity. Even more importantly, all of these fields, all of these crops, even all of these hedgerows and so forth, they are all part of what we call the landscape. So it's not only about the local crop, but actually what will happen locally on your field is very much determined by the landscape that is surrounding the field. And I try to highlight this here with this blue box to show you what I think of when I mean a landscape. So it's the surrounding fields, the surrounding forests, even the surrounding hedgerows, and all of these can be very important what happens on your field locally. And this is what we call the composition and the configuration of the landscape. And we come also to this point also about land sharing and land sparing later today. What comes with this, because your field, your local field is embedded in this landscape, is these organisms, this associated biodiversity is moving around in the landscape. And sometimes this can be something very beneficial. For instance, when we think about birds and birds that feed on the pest species on our crops, then it can be very beneficial. Then we want the birds actually to leave the hedgerow or to leave the forest and come to our crop to feed on these pest species. And we call this moving of the organisms in the landscape, we call this spillover. So the spillover is basically meaning, like these arrows here, organisms moving in the landscape. But there can also be negative spillover effects. For instance, there can be pest species or pathogens which come actually from the natural surroundings and which then attack our crop. And of course, this kind of spillover process we do not want to have in our landscapes. We come to this later on, and the final point I will make today is also that all of this, it's not only say about biodiversity, but actually everything, also the landscape, is embedded in what we call a social ecological system. So it's all also embedded in a social frame. And what farmers do in landscapes, what nature conservationists do in landscapes, is all very much determined by the social sphere And of course, also the economy. There's always economic motivations why people do certain things and not others. And I strongly believe that actually to achieve a sustainable land use in the long term, we need not only to focus on the biodiversity, but we must also include the economy and also the social sphere to understand how we can develop more sustainable landscapes in the future. So let me take you a bit on a short journey. We start at the local scale. Don't worry, I'm not going to detail all of these here. I'm just going a bit on some aspects. And I want to take you always across one or two examples of all of these points and then come to a conclusion in my presentation. So let's start at the local scale, so at the field scale. And I decided for this that I use a system which is, I think, very familiar to many of you. For me, a couple of years ago, when I first visited Indonesia, it was also the first time to see these oil palm plantations. And I'm still amazed by them because I think they are quite fascinating. On the one hand, it's of course quite different to the rainforest, obviously. On the other hand, it's always interesting also to see how much benefits oil palm also brings to these people who farm them, and how it could also improve the welfare of farmers. And I think this is a nice or interesting contrast. Yeah, so you have the biodiversity conservation on the one hand, which is important, but you also have the economic development on the other hand, and which is also very important. And we need to find ways how to combine the two. And I want to talk about, actually, Budami already mentioned this efforts project in Jambi province, and I want to very shortly talk about an experiment that is being done there. And this is what we call the oil palm management experiment. And this experiment here, it's done in this state-owned plantation in these very large blocks of oil palm. So it's a very large monoculture oil palm plantation. And inside this plantation, we have established these different plots with very different oil palm management. And actually these symbols, I should explain these first. So NPK, this is always the nutrients, so always the fertilizer. And NPK just means the normal amount of nutrients are given. So this is what this here stands for. This skull and bones, it's a bit dramatic, actually a bit dramatized even. This is indicating that we're using normal herbicides, so glyphosate, to kill all the weeds underneath the oil palm. Yeah, so this is basically the normal management, normal fertilizer and glyphosate. And then what we are interested in is what happens if we do not use glyphosate anymore, for instance, but instead of glyphosate, we use this manual weeding. So the scythe here, this shows that farmers are manually weeding and not using glyphosate anymore. We are wondering, does this maybe increase biodiversity? Does it help? Or is it actually negative because it reduces the yield of the oil palm? And we have this in different combinations. So here the manual weeding is combined with the normal fertilizer. But then there's also another treatment where we reduce the amount of fertilizer, but we kept the glyphosate. And then there's a last treatment where there is less fertilizer and only manual weeding, so no usage of glyphosate anymore. And this is also what is shown here in these different colors on the map on the left side. So we got several plots of each of these treatments. And now the question was, what happens if we do this more, say, biodiversity-friendly management with the manual weeding and the less fertilizer being applied? Will it have positive effects on biodiversity? And will it maybe also have negative effects then on the crop yield of the oil palm? And I'm going to show you this figure here first. This figure here is about actually the gross margins, so the profits of the oil palm company. Yeah, it's not showing the real figures. You do not see the Indonesian rupee here right now, but it's just to show you in a very broad sense what is the revenue, the costs, and then the gross margin, so the profit of the company. And what we have here on the left side, actually, this dot here, this is the normal fertilizer treatment, so conventional fertilization and the usage of the herbicide. Then here we have the normal fertilization and the manual weeding. Here we have the reduced fertilization combined with the herbicide. And then the last dot here is actually the reduced fertilization combined with the manual weeding. And the very interesting thing you can see is that these dots go up. And so this basically means that actually the profit increases with our treatments. So they actually make more money by using less fertilizer. And even this manual weeding is not really having a negative effect on their profits, but may even have a positive effect. And how can this actually be? Yeah, it's a bit unintuitive. Why should using less fertilizers actually generate more profit? The reason why this was found is actually that the reduction in fertilizer that we did here did not affect the oil palm yield. So the palms yield the same amount of oil with the reduced fertilization. But of course, if you reduce the amount of fertilizer, you have a direct saving because you need to use less, and there you also have a reduced cost for the fertilizer. So it's actually quite interesting. It seems that these plantations, they have a very intensive management, but they could do with less. They could use less fertilizer, and they could also even abandon this glyphosate and still have the same amount of oil palm yield, and thereby also have actually less of these direct costs, so these red bars, and thereby also increase their profits. So there seems to be opportunity to reduce the costs without reducing the yield of the oil palm. Of course, we also studied the biodiversity. I'm not detailing everything here, but the main finding was actually that the plants shown up here and also the below ground animals shown here, they all responded very positively to this reduced management. So they responded positively to the reduced fertilizer as well as to using the manual weeding instead of the herbicide. There are other organisms which did not show any response. So here the bats and the birds are shown, or their activity is always shown, and also their species richness. And they did not really show a clear response to that. So you can profit some organisms like plants or also below ground animals, but you may not be able to profit the full biodiversity of the oil palm plantation by applying this reduced management. So, but all in all, I think these findings are very promising. They show that even in these intensive monocultures, we can do something for biodiversity, and we can even reduce the amount of these chemicals without harming the economic component or the profit of the agricultural system. With this, I would like to shift now to the landscape scale. And actually here, I want to talk a bit about a current debate, which is always very important. And this is the idea, how should these landscapes look like? And should we actually have a land sharing approach or a land sparing approach? The top left picture, this is showing here, this is a coffee agroforestry from Nicaragua. So this is what we call land sharing. It means that we integrate the nature conservation with agriculture. So what we try to do is we try to make the combination, for instance, of these trees with the coffee plants, and thereby we have our income from the coffee, but we also have these nice trees on top in this agroforestry system to maintain also biodiversity. We also have examples here from Europe. This is close to my hometown, where we have these grasslands, and they are also very biodiverse, but they are also used for agriculture. So also a bit of a land sharing system. But then in opposition to this, we have this idea of land sparing. And here the idea is, okay, we should maybe not combine agriculture and nature conservation because this is maybe not working. We should rather separate the two. And we should rather have very intensive agriculture like this rice field here. And then next to it, we should have a national park where there's no agriculture at all. And this is, of course, also something we often see in the tropics. So this huge separation between agriculture and nature conservation. And we also see this with forest patches here where I'm living in Germany actually as well. And the question is always, okay, land sharing, land sparing, yeah, sometimes one is better, sometimes the other is better. I'm actually thinking that nowadays with this big, massive influence of humans, we cannot only rely on land sparing. So we cannot only rely on national parks, but we need to think about this land sharing more and more also in the tropics, because there is just so few natural areas left. So we need to bring back also the biodiversity to the agricultural lands. And for this example of land sharing, I would actually like to take you to Latin America. to Colombia because there is one very interesting land sharing system that we have here. And this is also now about the animals, and that's why I also wanted to include it to also show you that it's not only about crops. And this land sharing system is a silvopastoral system. So silvopasture means that you combine your pasture, so your livestock, your cows in this case here, together with trees. Yeah, so silviculture. So you combine forestry and trees together with animals on the same amount of land. And this is a bit in contrast to what people normally do, because normally they tend to separate the two. They have their forest and they have their pasture. And also in Latin America, normally also you do not have this combination, but the pasture land is just for the animals and there are no trees at all. But the interesting thing is here, there are some studies on this topic, and people showed actually that by combining the two, actually, you get many, many more benefits than by just having a monoculture. So for instance, when you combine the pasture land together with the trees, this benefits this livestock, these cows, because the cows then, they cannot feed only on the grass itself, but they can also feed on the shrubs and the trees. And they actually like to do this because the shrubs and the trees, they contain other kinds of nutrients. And thereby also actually the cow becomes more healthy from feeding on these additional resources. What we also find is actually people can have way larger stocking densities, so many more animals per amount of land in these silvopasture grasslands with trees than on a grassland monoculture. Again, a bit surprising. You would think that a monoculture grassland, it's more easy to feed all the cows, but actually the opposite is true. First of all, the cows, they like these additional trees, as I said. And secondly, these trees, they can also bring nutrients back to the soil and thereby also make the grass grow quicker. And this again can allow you to have more livestock, more cows on your farm than if just having a monoculture. In addition, it's also, of course, about climate mitigation. So having these trees also means that a lot of the carbon is also stored, which otherwise would be just emitted to the atmosphere. There's also habitat for wildlife like birds, and the trees and the shrubs, they also increase the water infiltration and the drought resilience of these landscapes. So all in all, it's actually quite a convincing argument that having these grasslands monocultures is not such a good thing, but combining them with the trees in a land sharing approach benefits your livestock as well as the farmer in the long term. Even more importantly, when we do this combination of grasslands together with trees, these land sharing approaches, we can also start to think about our landscape again and start to think about how can we regenerate or rehabilitate the landscape. You know that nowadays many of our forest landscapes, they are very fragmented. So forests are very isolated, and there is maybe these monoculture crops or grasslands in between, and then animals cannot move easily through the landscape. Now, by using this kind of silvopastoral systems, so combining trees with grasslands, we can actually start to regenerate the connectivity of the agricultural landscape and the agricultural matrix. And this is shown here on this picture. So in the foreground, within this yellow area, so this is everything in the lower left here, what we have is secondary forest, so forest that is coming back after deforestation. And maybe we want to link this secondary forest here with our patches in the background, these orange parts here, so the last remaining forest fragments. And we can link them actually by using these kind of land sharing systems. So in blue color, what we have here in the center, this is an eucalyptus plantation. So normally something that is very bad because the eucalyptus takes up a lot of water. But here the eucalyptus is combined with, you see this tiny shrubs here in between, combined with shrubs and grasses for the livestock to feed the livestock. And thereby the whole eucalyptus plantation becomes much more biodiversity friendly and allows you now to link your secondary forest to the forest fragments in the background. And on the right corner, we also see these monoculture grasslands and how they look like when the regeneration of the forest is just starting. So in the long term, also on this red area here will become more like the foreground, and like this nice regenerating secondary forest. And so combining these different land sharing and land sparing elements in the agricultural landscape can make the full landscape more biodiversity friendly, and thereby benefit your agricultural system as well as the biodiversity. Now, I already said it's about making the landscape more biodiversity friendly and making it easier for animals to move in the landscape. And this brings me now to this third point, the spillover of organisms. So animals moving from natural areas to agricultural areas, from forests to cropland, from hedgerows to cropland, and thereby also contributing to agricultural production. And in this case, actually, I want to take you to South Africa. So this is a picture from the very northern part of South Africa, close to Kruger National Park. So it's close to the Zimbabwean border of South Africa. And here, actually, we are in the border of the subtropics and tropics. And people are planting a lot of macadamia nuts in this region. So normally the region would look like the background. So you would have these very nice forests. It's also very hilly. There's also maybe a mixture of forest and savanna. So a bit like these savanna landscapes where elephants and lions are roaming. But today this is all being converted to these macadamia plantations. And this looks then on this picture. So in the background, you already see the macadamia trees also here. And these are areas that have been recently cleared for planting new macadamias. Now, today, actually, South Africa has become the world's largest macadamia producer. This is a bit surprising because macadamia comes from Australia, but because of this tremendous change in South Africa, they are now the world's largest producer. At the same time, South Africa is very much in danger of climate change, of droughts especially. And then there's also this problem of the land use change I just mentioned. So people are clearing the forests, clearing the savanna, and planting this crop. And thereby they are also reducing biodiversity. Now for macadamia, which flowers like on this picture, you have these very nice purple or whitish flowers. And then there is pollinators like the honeybee, which are very important for the production. For macadamia, this may be even a problem, because macadamia actually needs pollination, and a lot of these pollinators come from the surrounding landscape. Yeah, it's not that they are all living on the farm, but often pollinators are living in the forests, and they need to come on the macadamia farm to pollinate the trees. And we did a small experiment to show the importance of pollination. So what we did actually, we did an experiment where we had pollinators excluded, so no pollination at all. And when you exclude the pollinators, then actually from all of these very tiny flowers, very, very few will only produce a nut later on. So 1 out of 200 flowers may produce a nut later on. And this is how these macadamia nuts are looking like. If you have the pollinators around, this is very good for you, because then you will get between 3 and 5 nuts per 200 flowers. So about 300 to 400% more crop yield if you frame it that way. Interestingly, we also looked then if pollination is efficient right now, or if it could still be improved. And we did this with hand pollination. So in addition to the bee, we put pollen ourselves on the flowers to see if we could still rise the amount of nuts being produced. And interestingly, this can even be done. So you could make this even more efficient by doing hand pollination, but this is not really an option on these farms because there's way too many trees and this is just not possible. But the exercise illustrates the very high importance of animal pollination for crop yield. And this animal pollination depends a lot on the wild living insects in the surroundings of the farms, and this is very much endangered. In addition, bats and birds are also very important. And I come to this on my second slide, because bats and birds are very important for the biocontrol and the pest management in macadamia. And this kind of pest management is shown here. So we also did a lot of bat and bird studies on these macadamia farms. And there's also some very stunning pictures like this bat species. You can see in its mouth, there is this stink bug, so a green vegetable bug. An older version of the one you see here down on this picture. And these green bugs, they are the main pest species of macadamia, and they cause huge crop losses because these stink bugs and also other species, they like to develop inside the nuts, yeah, like this larvae here. And then, of course, you cannot harvest the nut anymore. And together with our South African partners, we made models of how much value this provides, and we estimated it at about $600 per hectare per year. This is the biocontrol value of these beds that feed on these pest species and thereby increase the amount of nut production. But we wanted to know this also a bit more in detail. And for this, we set up an exclusion experiment, which uses cages surrounding these trees. Budami and others know this very well. Tia Chanke and others, they also did this on Sulawesi with cacao production, and others did it in Sumatra with oil palm to understand if excluding bats and birds can affect the crop yield of cacao or oil palm. And we did something different, or something very similar actually here in South Africa with the macadamia. And here on the lower part, you see one of these cages. So this is how it looks like. You've got these macadamia trees, you've got the cage and the surroundings. And what we now did is either the cage was closed the full time, so being closed night and day, or we would open the cage during daytime, and then the birds can fly in, but the bats at night, they cannot fly in because then it's still closed. Or we would open it at nighttime, so only the bats could go inside and feed on the pest species, but not the birds. Or the cage would be open the full time, and then bats and birds can easily feed on the pest species. And this is shown here. So control means the cage is open the full time. Night means it's closed during the night and only the birds can go inside. Day means it's closed during the day and only the bats can come into the cage at night. And then night and day means it's closed all the time. Neither birds nor bats can feed on the nuts. And we then looked at how does this affect these nuts and how does it affect the proportion of nuts without damage. So basically, the higher the number, the better the crop yield. So the more nuts do not have any damages from the pest species. And we found actually that when you exclude either the bats or you exclude the birds, or even worse, you exclude both bats and birds, you actually get many more problems with these pest species, and thereby also your amount of nuts without damage is reduced by easily 10 to 15%, on average a 13% greater crop damage. And we also compared this between complex landscapes where there is a lot of forest remaining, so habitat for birds and bats, with simple landscapes where there is no habitat for birds and bats left. And on average, we also found that the nut damage is actually higher in these simple landscapes. So the amount of nuts without any damage is lower on average. And this actually was quite a nice finding, because many farmers then came to us and told us, wow, I did not expect this. So these bats and birds, they are very important, and I want to do something for bats and birds on my farm now. And they asked us, what could I do? And then we told to them and showed them, hey, by having hedgerows or forests on your farm, you can increase bats and birds. And farmers are actually now starting to do this, or they also put up nest boxes for bats and birds to promote them on their farm, and thereby also promote this very important ecosystem service of pest control. Because remember, this basically comes for free to the farmer. Yeah, this kind of additional harvest and additional nut production generated by these bats and birds feeding on the pest species is just contributing like that without any additional cost to the farmer. So it's quite an important thing to show it to them, and thereby also make them aware of this kind of nature conservation possibilities. With this, I would like to come to the last part, which is going to be slightly longer than the spillover part. And I'm going to talk a bit about, say, not only the biodiversity side, but also about the social side. We already mentioned one social or economic point, which is very important. And here I mean the crop yield. So of course, the income of the farmer or the profit of the farmer is one very important economic point, but there's also many others which we need to consider when we want to contribute to a sustainable agricultural land use. And for this, I'm going to take you to Madagascar. So we stay in Africa, but we move from South Africa to the island of Madagascar. Here I was lucky to be part of a big project on vanilla production. And in the background on this picture, slightly blurry, sorry, you see already such a vanilla plantation. And these vanilla plantations, they are often done in these agroforests. So you have your trees and also your remaining natural vegetation. And inside these agroforests, the vanilla plants are being planted in liana-like vines here growing on the stems of the trees. This is how the vanilla plant looks like. So you can very nicely combine it with trees because you need trees anyways to grow your vanilla plant. And here's another such a picture. So you see the tree in the center and the vanilla vine surrounding the tree. And here the farmer is taking a good look after the plant. You can also see some of the vanilla flowers, these vanilla pots later on, which are very, very expensive on the market. And it's a very valued spice all over the world. And today, Madagascar is the world's largest vanilla supplier. And actually, so Madagascar, all in all, produces about 70% of the global vanilla production. And out this 70% of vanilla, almost 90 to 100 Sava region in northeastern Madagascar. So this is where all the vanilla basically comes from. And of course, there's a lot of changes in this area because of vanilla production. I already talked a bit about the plant. So the plant is very interesting because it needs these trees. It's also interesting because it's actually an orchid species, so a very specialized pollination, and it comes from Mexico originally. And nowadays it has been, the problem is when they introduced it, they did not introduce the pollinator of the vanilla plant. So there is no natural pollination on Madagascar, which means actually in turn, all of these tiny flowers, yeah, and there can be hundreds of these per plant, need to be pollinated by hand. So insects can't do the job. There are no insects that can pollinate this plant. So it's all done by hand pollination. It's because the vanilla prices, they are quite high. And I come to this in a second. This has also led to a lot of changes with the farmers in the region. So, but first of all, let's focus a bit on the cultivation. So this is actually very labor intensive and it takes a lot of time. So first of all, you need to establish a plantation and you need to plant your vanilla vine shown here. You stick it into the ground and then it crawls. This is mainly a work that is done by women and it can take easily several months per year doing this hand pollination. Then after some time, you get these green pods, like on this picture. Later on, they turn blackish, and this you may know from the supermarket. And the green pods, yeah, they are very valuable already. Not as valuable as the black ones, but already they cost a lot of money. And you need to then to secure it because theft and crime is a big issue in Madagascar. And people are stealing the pods from one another. So it's a big, big topic, how to secure your plantation and your harvest. You may either sell them green or you may continue here and cure your vanilla pods. So this means that there's an additional 3 months of work where you blanch the beans. Yeah, so you put them into hot water and so forth, and then you dry them in the sunlight, and then you get these black pods, yeah, which are like fermented vanilla pods. And those also have the very nice smell, and you can use it for cooking or for ice cream and others. And these are then sold on the world market. And 5 kilograms of green vanilla after this curing process results in about 1 kilogram of black vanilla. And this is then the most valuable crop that you can have. And this crop can be very, very expensive. So in the early 2000s, there was an extreme rise in vanilla prices, and their 1 kilogram vanilla was worth about $500 US. $500 US for 1 kilogram of vanilla. It's actually insane. at that time, this was almost equal the price of silver. So 1 kilogram of vanilla equaled the price of 1 kilogram of silver. Amazing. So there's always these boom and bust cycles in the prices in vanilla. What is shown here in reddish color actually is the vanilla price in time. And you see this steep rise in the early 2000s. And after this, it dropped again, yeah, because the market was suddenly flooded with vanilla and then the price dropped again. And you can see that there was another price rise again in 2012. And now it's dropping again. And we see these rhythms there. And in the background, you see actually how farmers respond to this, because the background is showing the amount of vanilla plantations being newly established. So these bars, the larger the bar, the more plantations were being established. And you can see that with the high prices, this is of course then motivation for many farmers to also start planting vanilla. And then also here with this price peak again, many farmers decided, okay, now I also need to plant vanilla. So there's a direct link between the prices on the world market and the land use decisions of people in the region. But of course, there's also the danger that with too many vanilla farmers, there's also an overproduction, and then the whole price drops again. And then there's always a danger that people may even have problems and may have less money later on with the plantation. We wanted to understand this in more detail, and for this we teamed up in this Diversity Turn project. It's a transdisciplinary research project. So first of all, we have different disciplines, so social sciences, economic sciences, and ecological or environmental sciences. But it's not only interdisciplinary, but also transdisciplinary, and this means that we also directly interact with the stakeholders, so the farmers and NGOs and also companies in this project, to understand the vanilla production in greater detail and to also understand all of these sustainability dimensions in much more greater detail, and also with direct interaction with the farmers in the region. For this, actually, it was very important to have an intercultural team. So many of the results I'm going to show you, actually all of the results, we had colleagues from Madagascar involved, and also with the local language, but also the local culture. This is so super important. And this is always a great, great benefit to have these intercultural interactions in these kind of projects. So here I just want to show you very broadly what kind of questions this project addressed. So we had some very general questions like how many people are actually involved in vanilla farming, how does it affect their income, and their livelihoods. But then there are also more directed questions, for instance, questions about fair trade. So in Europe, there's a lot of these fair trade certification schemes, so where farmers get more money for certain practices. And we wanted to understand who does actually engage in these certification practices and who doesn't. The social sciences were more interested in how does the organization among the farmers work. So when do people form, for instance, such cooperates or corporations among producers to have more a stronger voice on the market? Then we had also a livestock component with animal husbandry and the importance of this, especially for food security. And last but not least, there was the conservation group that I was involved in about the biodiversity value of these agroforestry plantings. And I just want to briefly give you some ideas about the socio-economic findings, and then I'm going to turn to the ecological findings. And first of all, what we found, actually, the farmers in the region, like him here, almost or more than 80% of all farmers in the region had a vanilla agroforestry planting. So basically, almost everybody who is involved in agriculture also was farming vanilla. So it's very attractive to many, many people. And yes, this farming and the money that comes with it has improved their situation. So they are able to buy these cars, to have nicer housing. And there's a big lifting out of poverty. Madagascar is still among the poorest countries in the world. So this is very important for the local people. But on the other hand, we found that many of them were still suffering from food insecurity. So there is more money, but apparently this does not help with food insecurity. And one major driver of this is the theft and the crime. And this is really a big, big problem. In these villages, I said it takes very long to cure your vanilla, and the pots are lying in the sunlight to dry. And theft and crime are a big problem. And there is also which go around in these villages, and they also with weapons steal the vanilla. And this is a big problem because it undermines the trust that you have in others in these villages. These contracted farmers with the certification, they get higher prices. So the fair trade or other certification seems to help also the farmers. But still, there's a big interest of really have a bigger voice in this very intensive market with a lot of competition. But the main problem for this actually is, first of all, there's a lack of confidence. So people are somewhat shy, and they are not really confident and do not really know how to form such a farmer group. And then there is the problem that they do not trust their fellow producers, so of their ideas or their knowledge with each other. And this is really very sad in a way, because there is this big chance of lifting people out of poverty, but there is also this big problem of lack of trust and integrity among each other. Let's turn a bit more to the biodiversity side. So 2 pathways how vanilla can be, or a vanilla plantation can be established. So in the upper row, what you see here is, if you start on the left side, you've got the last remaining primary forest or rainforest of Madagascar. Nowadays, most of these have already been transferred into forest fragments. And what you see nowadays in many parts is into this forest. And this is what we call forest-derived agroforestry. So you start with the forest fragment and you transform this into your vanilla agroforest plantation. On Madagascar, very interestingly, we have a lot of also these burned land use types. Again, a bit similar to Indonesia, where there's also a lot of these burned land uses. And then you have these fallow lands. And now that to the forest, but what you can also do is you can leave this land fallow, and then the trees start coming back, and you can then use the fallow for your agroforestry. So basically what happens in the lower row is that you come from a very degraded state, and also land which is not used at all anymore, and you basically regenerate the land and transform it into something very, very valuable for your crop production, from rainforest to agroforest, one which can be seen as the restoration or rehabilitation from fallow land not being used, made being productive again and very valuable again. And this is also shown in this comic here by a colleague of mine, Dominic Martin. He drew this. So the first row, this is this conversion or degradation of rainforest into agroforestry, and this comes often ecosystem services. And on the other end, there's this big chance of having open land or fallow land and degraded land, and to rehabilitate this land. And this then results in a gain of biodiversity and also a gain of ecosystem services. And we studied this now for these vanilla systems. And without showing the detail, let me just give you some idea. When you compare the rainforest to the forest-derived agroforestry, you see this loss in biodiversity. So there's 30% less species in the forest-derived vanilla plantation as compared to the rainforest. It's even higher when you only focus on endemic species, so only those species which are only living on Madagascar, but nowhere else. So there is almost 50%. So there is a big loss by turning rainforest into vanilla agroforestry, no doubt about that. But on the other hand, there is also this big restoration potential. So when we compare the biodiversity of these degraded lands and the biodiversity of these fallow or open land derived agroforestry, the agroforestry system has about 26% more biodiversity than the fallow land. So there's an increase by rehabilitating the land, or even more than 100% more endemic species as compared to the degraded fallow land. And this is now a big topic because you may know that next year we are going into the so-called United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So much research will also go into the direction of restoring land and restoring ecosystems and restoring biodiversity. And this lower part here, this can really be seen like such a restoration process from degraded land to more natural conditions, which also brings these biodiversity benefits. Of course, we did not only study the biodiversity, and we studied this actually for many groups. So we studied these for reptiles and ants and butterflies and frogs, birds, plants, and trees. But we also studied the crop yield of the farmers. And here we were mostly interested in, is there a trade-off between the amount of yield, the amount of harvest from the vanilla production, and the biodiversity of the production system. You do not need to care so much about the left side. You can just ignore this. What is important is here the right side. And all these dots, these are all vanilla plantations. And what we have here on the x-axis is the crop yield. So the amount of vanilla being harvested in kilogram per hectare. And this varies a lot. Yeah, so this is very few yield here, up to almost 400 kilogram. And remember, 1 kilogram of vanilla is easily worth 200, 300, 400 US dollars. So this is quite a lot of money that can be generated there. And what is on the y-axis here is the biodiversity of the agroforestry plantation, the biodiversity of all these groups here. And what we see is we see these dots and we do not see any kind of relationship. So there's no statistically significant relationship between biodiversity and crop yield. And this means that you can go from very tiny amount of yield to very high amounts of yield without reducing your biodiversity. So this shows that you can sustainably increase the production without compromising biodiversity. And this is something very good because it indicates that we can even intensify the production. For those farmers who do not produce a lot yet, show them how to produce more. And this will not come with additional biodiversity losses of these agroforest plantations. So this is something very good, and we summarized all of this information here. Again, you do not need to read everything. The important point is above here, this is all the different management variables that benefit biodiversity. Like having a lot of forests in your surrounding landscape, or also having a nice and complex canopy cover and underground vegetation. And this is all very important for biodiversity. And the important point is that the variables which are important for the vanilla yield, so the crop production, those are totally different. There it's not so much about canopy cover or understory vegetation, but it's much more about your planting density of the vanilla plants, so having more per area, the amount of time you spend on the hand pollination. These are all much more important. And this shows that one set of management variables is important for biodiversity. The other one is important for crop yield. And this now opens up the possibility to combine the two, because you can manage for biodiversity and it has no influence on your crop yield, and you can manage for crop yield and it will not negatively affect biodiversity. And thereby we can come to these win-win solutions of having high biodiversity and high crop yields. And this is, of course, something which is very attractive. Over time, this may even lead to more forest on Madagascar again. Again, this is a very complex figure, but let me take you through it very briefly. So what we see here is we always have the amount of forest cover in the year 2000. This is here on the x-axis. So these are patches of land where there was no forest in the year 2000, and this is now fully forest cover in the year 2000. And on the y-axis, we have the change from 2000 to 2010. So if it's going into this direction, then there was an increase of forest cover compared to 2000. So there was an increase in the amount of trees. And if it's going into the lower direction, then there was a decrease. So there was deforestation. And this image is just trying to show you that we see all of these processes in our study landscape. So on some parts of the land, we see this increase in forest cover. In others, we see the loss. And we need now to use these information and to tell people, hey, there are these portions of the land where you need to invest, especially in agroforestry, to rehabilitate the land, to reforest the land. Yeah, and without going into the details, this could give us some idea for this UN Decade on Restoration starting next year. I got one last example. It's only going to take me, I think, 3 minutes. I hope we still have those time, and then I'm very much looking forward to your questions. And I want to broaden the picture with this last example. And this is now again about agriculture and agricultural diversification. And for this, I'm going to take you to South America again, to Argentina and Chile. Not really tropical anymore, but I want to make the picture a bit more broader here. And here it's about the social benefits again. And what we see in these two countries, it's very interesting, is that when we compare Argentina and its agricultural production in 1999 and then in 2013, we see that there has been a trend towards agricultural specialization. So in Argentina, also there's more and more soybean being grown, and this dominates the market. And there's, say, this increasing specialization on a few very valuable crops. In Chile, on the other hand, it has stayed more or less the same, and there has even been a little bit of a diversification. And now the question is, how does the specialization or the diversification of agricultural production, how does this affect the social benefits of the people living in these countries? And this Lucas Garibaldi and Paris Mendes actually studied, and I found this very interesting. And I want to make this point at the end of my talk, again, to highlight it's not only about biodiversity. What Lucas and his colleague found was that in countries with a very high crop diversity, so a very diverse agriculture, there's also lots and lots of different inputs being used. So for all these different crops, you need to have specific inputs. Sometimes you even need to have specific machinery, and it also opens up possibilities for processing of the products later on and for selling them later on. And this diversity of employment that comes with the diversity of the crops also results in a greater employment of people in the agricultural sector. And in many tropical countries, there is still big unemployment, and also in other countries of the world as well, even here in Germany. And we need to think about how to give people jobs. And in contrast to this, when you have a specialization only on 1 or 2 crops, like in Argentina, you of course need less machinery, and you also have a limited amount of products later on because you specialize on this one crop. But this then also has a negative effect on your employment rate. So few people are employed in the agricultural sector. So the greater crop diversity also has social benefits because it opens up possibilities for people to become employed and to get jobs. And this is also very important. And Lucas and his colleague, they did not only study this for Argentina and Chile, but actually for many countries. And each of these dots here is one country. And the most important figure is the one here on the top, which shows that with a greater crop evenness, you could also say a greater crop diversity, a greater agricultural diversity, there is an increase in the employment rate in the agricultural sector. And I think this is, again, just to remind us, it's not only about biodiversity and nature, it's also about people. And when we want to have sustainability, we need to include people. And this kind of diversity can also benefit people as well. So let me conclude with this picture here. So we talked now about this local scale. We talked about the crops that can be grown there, the management, the herbicides, the pesticides, and so forth, which are very important. We now know that actually the landscape, the blue rectangle, can be even more important, especially when we think about these arrows. So this spillover of pollinators, bats, birds, biocontrol, and so forth. And we also learned a lot about the social sphere and the socio-economic trade-offs that also need consideration. And all of this is important so that we can manage not only for people, but also for nature and achieve a better harmony between the two. And for this, we need to, first of all, connect the landscape, but also connect ourselves more with nature back again. We need to reduce negative effects like these herbicides or fertilizer, which are not needed. And sometimes this can be easily done, and we need to think about that. We should create new things like restore the land, create new connections between lands used for agriculture, lands used for nature. And all of this, of course, must be sustainable, not only from a biodiversity point of view, but also from a social point of view. And with this, I'm now at the end of my presentation, and I hope it was interesting. I hope there were some new things to think about. I'm very much looking forward to your questions, and let me thank you once more again for your patience, for inviting me today to give this talk, especially to Ibu Dami. And it's a real honor to be talking to you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ingo. Wonderful, wonderful presentation. Very, very complete, very holistic.
I hope it was not too much. I fear that actually there were so many things I said, and I know I'm also talking very fast, so please excuse me. It's I'm talking often way too fast, but maybe it's not so important to remember everything, but to get inspired a bit and to think a bit in new directions, and I hope I achieved this purpose. So thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you, thank you. Now you didn't talk too fast. You speak perfect pace, so that's,
I tried.
That's wonderful. And then also, I think I would like to introduce the participants. So there are students, as I said earlier, from undergraduate and graduate from either from the entomology, plant pathology, but then also environmental science, agroecology, forestry. So there are diverse of students, but there are also faculty members.
Wow.
Faculty members from, I see from plant protection, and then also I see some from the forestry science, and maybe also from Jambi. There are also people from Jambi. So we have a mix of audience here. So really looking forward for your questions. There's already some question in the chat. So Pak Gianto, can I offer you the opportunity? Do you want to ask directly to Professor Ingo?
Bu Dami, excuse me.
Yes.
So we continue. Is it possible to take a picture first?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, we have to take a picture first.
Saya belum mandi,
Bagi yang mau membuka monggo. Yes, so Ingo, this is what we usually do, take pictures. So we need to take pictures.
Yes, of course. Very super cool. Very nice. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Silahkan Ibu.
Nadia, please. Baik, Bu. Yeah. Ingo, I miss the German accent, your English German accent, dialect. For some of us are from Germany, the alumni of Germany, we miss it. Pak Dadan and who else? We miss it.
Thank you so much. That's very nice. Often I try my best to hide it, but it's very nice. Actually, it sounds quite good, so that's good to know.
We miss it because, you know, like Bu Dami, American dialect, and it's difficult for us. We miss German dialect.
German dialect. Okay, so have we take pictures?
Yes, Bu. Yeah.
Kalau sudah selesai bilang ya, Bu Hagia.
Sudah, Ibu.
Oh, sudah. Okay. So we're finished with the pictures. So now let us with the question. So the first opportunity, I would like to ask Pak Gianto, if you would like to ask directly to Professor Ingo.
I have question in the chat, Bu Dami, but of course, if I can directly ask to Prof. Ingo, is okay. Very interesting. My question actually is, you have good information about palm oils and also maybe the rice farming in Indonesia. Is it possible to re-engineer the system? What do you think about this one for line sharing, and maybe it is really very interesting because actually not only palm oil, Indonesia has many kind of crop that actually can be designed as agroforestry, something like that. Okay, thank you. That is my point.
Thanks a lot. This is a very good question. It's a very good and also not easy question, but that's fair. That's good. Yeah, you also said it already. I think for palm oil, I think we have many possibilities we should think about. You said that palm oil could be interesting also for agroforestry. So to diversify the palm plantation by also including trees in addition to the palm. And you may also know these experiments that also Ibu Dami is involved with the biodiversity enrichment of palm plantations in the Efforts project. So where people are planting trees into the oil palm plantation, and then they look how do the trees grow, but also how does it affect the crop yield, so the productivity of the oil palm. I think one thing we need to be aware about is that when you make room for trees, yeah, you have to take out some of the palms as well. Yeah, so the trees can only grow very high and very nicely when you also cut some of the palms, and this also costs a bit of money, obviously. And I think there is possibility for doing this, but I think we would also need to combine this with some kind of certification or compensation if it comes at costs for the plantation owner, so that it's more attractive to plantation managers. Another possibility is maybe not even to include only trees, but you can also include livestock in your oil palm plantation, especially if you are a smallholder and you do not have the time or the money to spend on weeding all the time. And I know examples from Africa where actually a lot of the livestock is also kept within the oil palm plantation, and this may also be something for Indonesia. So rather than relying on these herbicides, for instance, on machinery, try to combine it with animals which take care of the weeds, and thereby you also have additional income, especially for these smallholder farmers. So again, a kind of land sharing practice between different agricultural production ways. So I think for oil palm, there's different ways to do this. We always need to bear in mind that we may need some compensation, yeah, and I think this is also very important. This is only fair. For rice, because you also included this, it might be more difficult because it's a bit hard to combine it. I know people in some places, they combine again animals with rice production. So especially if you have geese or ducks, yeah, like waterfowl, you can combine this nicely with your rice production, and they feed on your insects actually that feed on the rice plant, and thereby contribute even to pest control. And you have these geese and ducks in addition. But of course, you cannot just plant trees into the rice plantation. So you would need to think of something else. One way which is increasingly important, and people think about this a lot, is not to have very big fields. So instead of very, very big monocultures, it's often better to have smaller fields, and then you have all these field edges also for the rice field, and all these banks as well. And your species diversity of plants and insects on these banks surrounding your fields can be quite high. So I would rather think about something like making fields smaller, having more forest edges, more grassy banks in addition to the crop itself, and thereby reduce the pressure. And this can also actually help with your pest control. So there is also studies showing that in these complex rice landscapes with small rice fields and lots of adjacent vegetation, the pest control, the natural pest control can even be done without any pesticides. So I think there's several studies from Southeast Asia very nicely showing this. And maybe this is a way to think about it to make it a bit more sustainable. On the other hand, again, it's difficult, and farmers may be reluctant to do it, and we need to somehow motivate them to do this. And I think, again, some kind of biodiversity certification or some kind of government programs can be very influential there to get the process started. Thank you again for the very nice question. I hope I answered it more or less. it's very hard to give these very specific recommendations, but there's always something we can do for sure.
Thank you very much for your explanation. Very, very nice answer. Thank you, Bu Dami.
Thank you, Pak Gianto. Just a little bit comment listening to your answer. It's interesting to listen to you saying that it's beneficial to use, you know, like big mammals as also a kind of a weeding strategy. And here in Indonesia, the government actually has a program where the government would hand out for free hand tractors. So actually we're moving towards mechanization, and yet you're actually saying that it's wonderful to have this biodiversity friendly, which I completely agree. But sometimes in agriculture there are so many politics inside, so sometimes the politics is covering what is actually needed.
Yes. It's totally correct. I think also you always need different solutions for different farmers or people. So I mean, what I'm proposing with using mammals for the weeding, I mean, this is of course only possible for those farmers who also have some kind of livestock anyways.
Right.
Yeah, who are interested in having also livestock. And there I would recommend rather try to combine the two and not have, say, land for livestock in addition to your oil palm plantation, having it totally separated. Why not combine the two in that case? For other farmers, of course, mechanization is much more attractive, and I fully understand this because it takes much less time, and maybe it's even better than doing this glyphosate or herbicide application. So in a way, having some kind of machinery and doing it with the machinery might be better for the environment than using the glyphosate all the time, because it's not polluting the soil in addition. But on the other hand, we need then to think carefully about, for instance, how often do we mow these plantations? So if we have this hand mower, how often do we do this? Do we do this now, say, every 3 weeks or monthly, or do we do it a bit less often? Do we do it on the full farm or only around the palms, in these palm circles? Because this is then very much affecting how much plants and insects there are remaining. So if you mow everything, of course, you kill all the insects and you kill all the plants. But if you only mow around your palm and you leave the vegetation standing in the interrows, this can again be very beneficial for insects and thereby also for birds and bats on your farm. So machinery per se is not bad, but the question is, how do we use it? And how often
that's very important.
Yeah,
thank you. So there's another question here in Indonesian, so I'll try to translate that to you. This is from Ibu Titi, and her question is that, it's very interesting that you're introducing the landscape approach here, and she's wondering whether in Indonesia, is it possible to do that? Because the farmers have very, very narrow patch of land, less than half of hectare. So can you still do that when the farmers are very small, very, very small holder farmers? How do you think of a landscape approach when we have small scale farmers? Is it possible?
Yes, it's again a very critical point. I also see the problem that with many people having small parts of land, it's very hard to coordinate these kind of actions, because what is needed is some kind of coordination and some kind of general agreement also. How do we want to develop this landscape? And often this is done in a top-down approach. So maybe the local government thinks about landscape development and what should be promoted. And then there is, say, regional planning, and maybe also state companies become involved and so forth. But it's not really coming from the farmers themselves. So first of all, what is needed is, of course, more communication among the farmers, more communication also between the government and farmers. So I think these kind of transdisciplinary approaches are very important there, to first of all make everybody aware of what is going on. awareness of why is the landscape important. So as an example, if all smallholder farmers in the future, they are planting oil palm, then the full landscape will become basically a big oil palm landscape. There is no forest left. And this is a problem also for the farmers, because it may increase the risk of diseases, of pest species. There's these water issues with the groundwater pollution, the water streams pollution. Yeah, so it's what we call these tragedy of the commons. So the common resources are undermined, even though everybody thinks what I'm doing is not bad, but in combination, many people doing things, this can undermine the resource base for everybody, like water. And there, I think, yeah, to include this perspective, there is much more need for communication, for making aware of these issues, and then, of course, also for more communication between local people and government. I know this is not easy. It's also not easy in Germany. Even here, we have the same problems.
Yeah.
Yeah, our farmers are also polluting the environment, and the costs are borne by the society basically, and not by the farmers. So it's all outsourced. But I think this is the first step to start. And what other things you can do is you can then think about, again, for instance, things like certification schemes or getting, say, incentives to the farmers, so that you give the farmers money for certain things that they're doing, but they get more money when it's in a coordinated action. So when it's coordinated among the farmers, say coordinated management to maintain a very nice landscape, and to share the benefits, then there is, say, more money being paid. But I'm not sure if these kind of subsidy programs, if they're a big issue in Indonesia. I believe not so much. And also, again, here in Germany, we also have the same issues. We got lots of these subsidy programs, but they always fund the individual farmer. And they are never about the full farmer organization or the full landscape and coordinating all these actions. But in the long term, my thinking is this is really needed, because by this you bring people together and they develop a common idea. What should the landscape look like? And then they do things coordinated with each other, and then we may get there. But it's definitely a long-term goal, that's for sure. Yeah,
coordination is always hard.
Yes.
Okay, then there's another question from one of our students from Satrahayu. Sat, do you want to ask yourself? You can turn on your video and ask Professor Ingo.
I'm sorry, no.
No?
Okay.
Okay, so should I read your question, or do you want to read yourself?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No,
Okay, I'll read it for you, Pak Ingo. So, oil palm plantation is major income for Indonesia, for most people in Sumatra and Kalimantan. The plantation required huge labor, so it could increase the welfare. Is there any research collaboration planning on ecology service in Indonesia, especially in oil palm plantation? What is your idea for the best ecosystem services for oil palm, in oil palm?
Again, a very good question. Thank you so much for this. Thank you. First of all, yes, oil palm is very important, and it also creates a lot of labor opportunities. Interestingly, there is also colleagues from the Efforts Project from Indonesia and also from Germany who study these kind of labor interactions in oil palm and also in rubber on Sumatra. And what they found actually is that when you compare rubber plantations, which used to be the dominant land use on Sumatra, and still today it's about easily 50% of the agricultural land, the oil palm plantation needs actually less labor than the rubber plantation. So the oil palm is a bit less labor intensive than the rubber plantation, which is also for some farmers a motivation to actually do oil palm farming, because what this in turn means is you need to do less labor in agriculture, but you then have more possibilities to also work in other areas and also to have additional income opportunities. And so oil palm farmers often, they also have maybe another farm business, or they have another income source, or they can also have some subsistence farming like vegetables or a home garden for themselves. And this was not possible before, because with the rubber plantation, the whole family, to put it simply, was involved in producing rubber. So in fact, this is quite, again, a bit counterintuitive. Oil palm itself does need less labor. So it's a bit like this specialization idea. But on the other hand, this frees resources and opens up new opportunities for people to become involved in other things. And here the interesting thing is, and again, the difference is, the rubber production is often done both by men and women. I think you know this much better than I do, but just to remind ourselves. Whereas the oil palm production is mainly done, especially the harvesting and the plantation management, by men. Especially this harvesting, which is you need a lot of power and to do this harvesting. So the interesting thing is, yeah, these new opportunities, if we think about it with the oil palm, they should be especially attractive for women. But here I think it's also important to empower women and give them the possibility to benefit from this. So in an ideal world, we could think that, yeah, with oil palm, we need less labor, and especially the women are not needed on the oil palm plantation because they can't do this harvesting, for instance. Yeah. So the women now should have the possibility to do other things like, for instance, open up a small shop, or think about some other kind of business idea for the local community, and engage in these activities. And this could again have positive implications. But here, of course, it's then not only about, say, the amount of people needed in these jobs, but also about empowerment and participation and also communication to allow for this. So there's different perspectives to this. All in all, I'm honestly, I still see also the danger with this, especially on Sumatra and these oil palm landscapes, that everybody becomes very much dependent on oil palm, and it all goes into this specialization way. But if you think again a bit into other directions, there may be also possibilities that come with this, and maybe even especially for women who used to work a lot in these rubber plantations, but nowadays are not so much involved in the oil palm production. And again, it's also about, of course, also women's group and organizing, and to make use of these new possibilities.
Okay, thank you so much.
This is at least as an outsider, honestly. I'm obviously I'm not an Indonesian, so I cannot speak for you, and I should also not speak for you. It's up to you, and I think this is also something I think we should put trust in people, and try to help them where we can. But here I think actually the social scientists and the economists, they will know much better than I do, for sure, how to give this a positive direction.
Thank you. The next question is from Pak Surya. So I think, Pak Surya, are you still here? You're welcome to ask. There's Pak Surya. Silahkan, Pak Surya.
Bu Dami, hi Ingo.
Hi. Thank you.
Interesting presentation. So when we read a publication in an international journal, or when we attend international workshop, etc., land use change is often related to biodiversity. But mostly when people talk about biodiversity, what is in their mind is the wildlife biodiversity. So I think it's also clear when we read international publication about biodiversity, or it is mostly about wildlife. But what we are discussing today, and also what people in effort also doing research is most, I think it is more to agro biodiversity.
Yeah.
I think this different connotation also have a great impact on how people view biodiversity in Indonesia, for example. So every time we talk about biodiversity, people take it for granted because they think that we are talking about orangutan, about tiger, which is not in interest of farmer actually. So they take it for granted. I mean, they don't consider biodiversity as a very serious issue because every time people talk globally about biodiversity, it's only about orangutan, elephant. If people understand more that agro biodiversity is more important, then I think this is an incentive for them to implement the so-called land sharing, because land sharing is about agro biodiversity mostly. There is also about wildlife, but I think agro biodiversity is very important. I and Bu Dami is in Faculty of Agriculture. Actually, we are very interested in agro biodiversity, but because of this misunderstanding about biodiversity, people take it for granted when we are talking about biodiversity. What I think for our point of view in Indonesia, agro biodiversity is far very important. And I think that's my comment. Probably you have opinion. Probably can you comment on this case? Thank you, Ingo.
Thank you so much. It's a very important point that you highlight. And I'm also terribly sorry because I did not make it clear in my presentation the whole time. I was also just talking about biodiversity the whole time, but you are totally right. Depending on whom you talk to, depending who talks about these topics, this can mean many different things. And sometimes we, as you say, biodiversity, especially people think about wildlife, tigers, orangutans, rainforests, whereas agrobiodiversity is much more linked to the agricultural system. I think this kind of thinking that when people tell you or talk about biodiversity, that many tend to think first about the natural forest or the orangutan. I think this comes from this, let's call it traditional nature conservation idea. So that nature should be conserved in these protected areas, a nice rainforest, national park, and that basically we have nature on the one side and agriculture or humans on the other side, a bit like in this land sparing idea. And this is why people also then tend to think, okay, nature is only in the national park and there is no biodiversity on the other side. Yeah, and then they also forget about all these services, or they are not aware of them, at least, like this pollination and pest control. So I fully agree. First of all, we must make people more aware that there is also biodiversity, or in this case, agrobiodiversity in the agricultural landscape, and that this brings important benefits. I'm fully agree. And secondly, there is also the problem that in many parts of the world, and also in the tropics, this traditional nature conservation approach with just having the national park and then having the humans on the other side has not really helped to stop declines in biodiversity. So we also see that species are declining also in national parks. In part, this is sometimes due that these national parks, they are just very small, small islands surrounding by seas of agriculture. And we know this from our courses, a small island, there is no species coming in, and then there is extinction in the island, and the orangutan slowly dies out in this island, for instance. This is why we also need to think about how to maintain also at least some of the biodiversity or the agrobiodiversity in the agricultural landscape matrix. And this then brings us to this idea of land sharing. So land sharing not only for having agrobiodiversity, but land sharing even also for helping the wildlife. For instance, to help the orangutan to move then from the forest island through maybe an agroforestry plantation to the next forest island, to connect the landscape again a bit better. So I think these are the reasons, first of all, why people make this kind of divide. Sometimes it's also a bit blurry. What is biodiversity? What is agrobiodiversity? What is planned? What is associated? Where are the interactions and the benefits? And then there is an increasing realization that we also need to do nature conservation, not only in protected areas, not only in national parks, but also outside. This is even more problematic in the temperate zones, because we have basically no wildlife left. It's all modified by humans. It's really that dramatic. In the tropics, there is still the chance to have these protected areas, and we must have them and conserve them and protect them. But we have the danger that increasingly in the surroundings of these parks, there is only, for instance, intensive agriculture. And this also is dangerous in the long term for these national parks. And there we need to think about also the agrobiodiversity and the land sharing as well. Thank you very much for this very important point that you highlighted.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, the next question. I hope you still have energy, Ingo.
I have lots of energy. My day is just starting.
Okay. And you have coffee there, so that's good. Okay, the next question is from a student. Her name is Zaida Fairuzah from the Plant Protection. Zaida mau bertanya langsung, silahkan.
Thank you very much, Ibu.
Yes.
I'll try, but hopefully the signal will not trouble us. Thank you very much. Hello, Prof.
Hello.
Your presentation is really interesting and inspiring. You look really young and smart.
Thank you.
Oh, compliment.
Okay, I want to ask a question. Maybe you have experience for rubber plantation. What do you suggest for the other plants that can be planted or combined surrounding the rubber plantation in order to protect the rubber plant from the potential pest or disease? Because as my experience, for the leaf fall disease, the plantation with combined with palm oil, the attack intensity is less than the plantation only one commodity or only rubber plants. And the next question, how to collect or raise the beds or birds to maintain them in our plantation? Because just like us in palm oil, to control rats, we need to know how to raise and keep them there, because they can escape if we cannot maintain them there, such as like giving them couple in their cage. Thank you in advance, Prof.
Thank you so much for these very nice and very cool questions. Thanks a lot, and for the compliment as well. Thank you. I'm not sure if I can answer these questions in full detail or fully satisfactory, because I'm not a real expert on the two, but I try my best. So the first question was about how to reduce the pest problems and disease problems in rubber plantations, and what kind of plants can be combined either in the surroundings or inside the plantations. So I know that there is discussion of trap crops. So that it could be trap crops, which are sometimes, for instance, used in, you may know these push-pull systems. Maybe you've heard about this. So for the pest control, a crop which is attracting the insect outside of your main crop, it pulls the insect away. And others which also have some kind of chemicals, allelochemicals, which push the insects also outside of your plantation. I'm not so sure how this development is working right now with rubber and oil palm. I think maybe 1 or 2 years ago, I read about a story about these kind of trap crops for oil palm. I've got a feeling that maybe even Ibu Dami was involved in this. So the idea of having specific crops which take the insects out, and then they do not affect your rubber or oil palm anymore. So I would if I were to start on this topic, I would look a bit into this direction. The other idea is that if there is no specific plant that helps a lot, then maybe it's better to just increase plant diversity, because there is this idea of this protection of crops from pest species by having a higher diversity of surrounding plant species. And they are basically, they have a dilution of the herbivores, a dilution of the diseases, because there is just not a monoculture of a crop. And this is applicable, I think, both to rubber and to oil palm. So you should also increase diversity so that the herbivores, the pest species, and the pathogens, that they cannot build up these very large populations. And in part, this can also be achieved by having smaller plantations with surrounding shrubs and trees. But if you already have a very large plantation, then I would rather go into this direction of planting the trees in between the rubber or the oil palm trees to protect them there. But I'm also aware that this may not be feasible in plantations which are already very old, because you won't be taking out your rubber trees, for instance. And here, honestly, I'm not really an expert, but these kind of catch or trap crops, they could be very interesting if they are really working. So thinking about the chemical interactions between herbivores and their plants, how to disturb this, how to use this to bring the herbivores outside. So at least for insect pests, this can help a lot. And I know that there's also research going into this direction, but I'm sorry, I don't know the full details there. Sorry for the not very satisfying answer. Your second question was about owls and rat management, which also...
It's okay, really clear, and thank you very much.
Yes. Okay. Maybe briefly to your second question about the bird management. Of course, one big thing is to put up boxes, so nesting boxes for birds or for bats. So for bats, we've put up these nesting boxes in these macadamia landscapes in South Africa, and farmers also like this actually. But of course, you need to talk to the farmers first and convince them that bats are also or can be a good thing. And likewise, colleagues of mine, they have put up bird boxes for owls because they also have problems with snakes and rats, and the owls are then feeding on these owls, on the snakes and the rats. Yes, there is of course the danger that they are leaving. I mean, having a big cage is probably not feasible, but of course what the main purpose of these boxes is that they are nesting. And if they are nesting, if they're having young chicks which are growing, then they will have them in this box, and then also they will always return to the box. Yeah, and so they will also forage in the surroundings and stay there locally. And for them, it's much more efficient to do it this way. They won't be interested in flying very far away. They rather try to find the food in the surroundings. So you should try to not only have them on your farm for this pest control, but also make them happy so that they start breeding. And once they start breeding, I think there's a good chance that they will also prey on the pests on your farm. And I'm not totally sure for oil palm, would be interesting to study this. But again, I know from other crops in South Africa, for instance, this is also done by farmers. They have owls on their farm for rat control, and it works very well. So again, a very nice way also to bring people into contact with these very important organisms like birds and bats. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Prof.
Okay, thank you, Zaida. The next question is from James. Jim is a student, a master's student, and I think he's located in is it Kenya? Are you from? Sorry if I forgot, if I'm wrong about the country, but it's not Indonesia. James, you can ask directly to Professor Ingo.
I think you need to unmute.
You're still mute. You need to unmute.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes. To make myself clear, I'm from Tanzania.
Tanzania, sorry.
Yes, yes. But Kenya is among of the East African countries. It's okay too. So I was asking on how to select the suitable trees for agroforest practices, since I have been observing some have negative impact, I mean negative interaction, including the allelochemicals. Some cause much shade on the agricultural crops. So sometimes if you introduce the project to the farmers, it's likely to deny that this is not working, it will harm our agricultural crops and so forth. So maybe there are specific procedures on how to select. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks so much. So first of all, thanks a lot for joining, also even from Africa. I'm very much amazed by the seminar. It's brilliant. And thanks a lot for the very nice question as well. So you highlight an important point there, that in all these agroforestry solutions, it's not only about having trees, but also selecting the correct trees. And I fully agree. So there's different ways to approach this problem. For some tree species, we have a more or less good understanding how they interact with their environment. So here I'm mainly thinking about, for instance, leguminose or fabaceae tree species, which are often used, like Gliricidia, being used all over the world in agroforestry systems, where we know, that these fabaceae trees, they bring nutrients back to the soil, and this is often also the purpose. So we have them for bringing nutrients to the soil, and in addition also for providing shade. Often farmers also, or at least there's a lot of knowledge on how to prune these trees, so you can modify the shade to your needs locally. But of course, this is not a one-fits-all solution, but depending on where you are on the globe, you will have very different trees available, and you need to choose from those. When it comes to allelochemicals, I think the only thing to do this is by having nice studies locally with these trees to understand what kind of allelochemicals do these trees emit, how do they interact with the insects, and we need field trials and studies with and without these trees to understand these processes, because this will always be different depending on where you are. And also, these allelochemical interactions you cannot do without any kind of field studies. You may, of course, over time make this a very efficient product, and then hopefully also export it to other regions, but I think this takes time. The shade management that you mentioned, so farmers saying it brings more negative sides, this is also a bit a question of perception sometimes. So sometimes I agree having lots of shade is really bad for your crop. Or there can also be competition for water between your crop and the trees. So you need to be aware, how much light does my crop need? And maybe I'm providing too much shade, and then it's a bad thing. And also, for instance, when you look at the root structure of the trees and the crops, it's probably advisable that the roots of the trees go deeper than the crop plants, so they do not use the same, say, water resources, but there's rather not the same water level and roots, but a complementarity between the rooting system of your trees and your crops. It's again, I realize it's all very general, but I think all these things need to go into consideration there. But what I want to also say is that these negative effects especially with the shading of the crops, this is also sometimes a question of short and long-term perspectives. I think this also needs to be considered. So on a short-term basis, it may be very good for your crop yield and your growth to reduce the amount of shade and to reduce the amount of trees, because you get a boom in your crop production by having more sunlight on your crop. So I'm thinking about coffee, for instance, here right now. Yeah, these sun coffee plantations, it's way higher productivity than the shaded coffee. But in a long-term perspective, and this is again sometimes a bit tricky to communicate to the farmers, so over several years or even decades, this can result in a lot of problems, because once you've cleared all the forest and there is no trees left and it's all sun coffee everywhere, then you may, for instance, be hit by a drought. So there is a very bad year, a very hard drought, or several years of drought, and the shade is then missing and all your coffee plants are getting stressed. You may also be hit by pathogens and insect pests because you got these big monocultures now. And as I said, in a big monoculture, the insect pests, they build up higher populations. And then if there are no trees remaining, of course, it's very likely that you get a big insect outbreak. So that then actually you suddenly have your plantation going to waste. And in Western Africa with cocoa plantations, we also see this, I think, especially in Ivory Coast, that there's huge plantations of cocoa, sun-grown, which nowadays they just have to burn these plantations. There's so many pathogens and so many problems, they can't farm there anymore. And they are thinking now how to go back to an agroforestry system with trees. So what I want to say is the decision what trees to select should be first based on of course, how fast is the tree growing? Is there any chemical reactions or not? How much water does the tree use? How much shade does it provide? I think these basic abiotic and biotic interactions locally. But secondly, you also need to think about the long-term perspective. So say, for instance, sun-grown coffee on the short term may give very high yields, but in the long term, we know that it's not very resilient to climate change. And we know climate is changing, and we know that pathogens and pests are spreading, and you need to have this long-term perspective. And then it's sometimes rather advisable to have a bit less yield, say only 80% or 90%, but have it more stable with the shaded system than having 100%, and next year it's going down to 30, and then maybe back to 70 or so, yeah, to think about this long-term resilience of the system. These are, yeah, maybe some basic ideas, but I know that this is also not a very satisfactory answer. I think what one really needs is also local knowledge, also how fast do trees grow, also about the multi-purpose use. Often you do want to have these trees not only for shade or so, or nutrients, but also maybe as wood for housing, or even food from fruit trees. And their local knowledge can be very important. And people often have this knowledge. So I think it's again also about transdisciplinary communication and involving them. And then there are these more theoretical or practical considerations. So do I want to add nutrients? Do I have water problems? And all of this. And yeah, sometimes agricultural extension officers will have this knowledge from field trials. But in other cases, yeah, probably the local knowledge is maybe even better than these general recommendations that we scientists can do there.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry for not being totally specific.
No. Well, the time is almost, well, we still have about 3-4 minutes, but there are still quite some questions. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm just going to read all the questions so you know the variety of questions there are, and you can pick one where you want to answer, because I know we don't have time, but I think I need to read all of the questions because they have been asked. So I think it's good to read them. Okay, so saya aja yang bacakan ya biar cepat karena waktunya sudah habis. The next question is actually from Naimas Ayu. Her question is about community behavior. How does a community behave? How do you maintain the landscape and biodiversity through the community behavior? I think that's one question of hers. And then she was also asking, maybe the question needs to be tweaked, because the question here is, how do you start recovery from extinction of biodiversity? And I think if it's already extinct, it's extinct. So maybe she's asking more about the restoration. So that's a question from Naimas. And then the other question is, this is in Indonesian. It's actually about peatland, peat soil in central Kalimantan, for instance. She's saying that in peat soil, now people or the government is also encouraging to plant crop plants. And then there's this rice boom in central Kalimantan in peat soil. And actually, it's not really quite good because it can provide a negative effect, and it can actually result in insecurity, food insecurity in the future, because changing of the land uses in a peatland where we know it's very vulnerable, right? Yeah. So how do you overcome this? So that's another type of question. And then the third question is habitat loss is the most serious threat to insect conservation. There is little point in trying to conserve species where their environment is no longer suitable, particularly in parts of the focusing on areas with altitudinal variation. Look in the land use transformation in the Sava. It may be a win-win solution that can be done, but what are the first steps that needs to be taken if the most worrying aspect of climate change occur in the future? Okay, so basically she's asking about climate change. What is the first step that needs to be done? And the last question is also a climate change question. Global warming affect availability of land suitable for certain crops, example, coffee, which needs a certain altitude, as well as influence the biodiversity of beneficial insects such as pollinators, parasitoids, etc. What kind of adaptation needed in agro-ecosystem practices to minimize the impacts of this climate change? So the last two questions are more to climate change. If you can just, wrap up and yeah.
Okay, I try my best. Thank you all very much for these very kind and very insightful questions. And first of all, let me say once again, it has been a real pleasure to discuss with you. And I'm also very happy for your patience in staying so long and my lengthy explanations. Okay, I'll try my best to wrap this up somehow. I've not gone into climate change today much. This also has in part to do with my research, which is more about land use change. But of course, you name it, this is all interacting. And with habitat loss, there is also the danger of climate change effects becoming even more pronounced because animals and plants cannot move anymore, or pollinators are missing, and crops then may get into trouble. I think all in all, and this also is a bit related to the restoration question, so the first one, and also to the second question about the rice boom. I'm more and more convinced that the danger is there where we try to specialize too much on a single form of agriculture. So my personal opinion, at least, is that this kind of specialization only on rice, or only on oil palm, or only on say a specific part of the landscape and not other parts of the landscape. Yeah, so specialization both on crops, on agricultural systems, on how we do our landscapes. This is making us vulnerable to changes. And with changes, we can think about climate change, but it's also making it much more difficult to restore biodiversity and to bring species back. Yeah, once you have transformed the full landscape into a monoculture, it's almost impossible to bring species back. But it's much easier if you maintain the landscape itself in a more diverse structure. And the same, and this is also what I try to do at the end of my presentation, the same can be thought about even for nations and for our economies and also for how we people interact. Diversity is super critical. It's very important. It's not only agrobiodiversity, not only biodiversity, it's also social diversity. It's also diversity of our economic system. And I'm not a big speaker, I'm not a politician, I'm not trying even to go into this direction, but I think if there's one vision and one thing that tries to wrap this up and which will also hopefully make us more resilient to climate change, it is to diversify rather than to specialize, and to rather use the diversity, use traditional knowledge, use local knowledge, use also scientific knowledge, engage with people, engage with stakeholders and farmers, but even just with people in cities. Yeah, as I said, many people are living in cities and they do not interact with nature anymore, and to make them aware of these issues. But on the other hand, of course, also we need to have more of communication also between governments, and also there also to not specialize too much in one direction or the others, but also to interact more closely and maintain the diversity that we still have. And with this, I mean biodiversity, but also the diversity of agricultural practices, of landscapes, of social diversity, because I think this is the best insurance that we have. If you think of it in the long term with climate change, with population growth, with land use change, we should think about resilience and insurances and something we can fall back on in times of crisis, like right now in this very strange year that we're having right now. And it's also a very special crisis. And we fall back on our diverse resources that we have. And that's why it's so important to maintain these. Yeah, maybe this is bit broadly again, but the kind of answer I would like to give to all of these remaining questions. And as a take-home message, because once diversity is lost, it's very hard to bring it back. So we should try to maintain as much of it as possible as right now. So with this, thank you once more for this fantastic morning for me, afternoon for you. And thanks to all the patients for staying along so long. Also, I want to wish you all the best because for me, this has been a very strange year, also sometimes very exhausting. It might also have been for you, I reckon. And therefore, I wish you all the best and that you stay healthy, that you stay motivated and positive, most importantly. And all of us, of course, that we have also a good start into the next year then, which hopefully will be a bit calmer and a bit more normal again.
Bit more normal, yes.
Thank you, Prof. Nice to know you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Ingo. Let's give a big applause to Professor Ingo for being our guest speaker today.
Thank you to you.
Yeah. And also the organizer, should I give this opportunity back to you, Ibu Evi or Ibu Hagia? Would you like to say something? Or there's a okay. Professor Ingo.
Very good.
There's a certificate from the department.
I'm going to take a screenshot now. Let me take a screenshot. This is very nice because I got Budami and myself and the certificate on the screenshot.
Yay!
Okay. Just a second and cheese.
Cheese.
Yeah, wonderful. Oh, thanks so much.
Okay.
That's very nice. Thank you.
Ibu Evi, would you like to say something? Ibu Evi is the organizer, Pak, of Professor Ingo. So there's Ibu Evi, there's Bu Hagia. Monggo, Bu Evi.
Iya, makasih Bu Dami. Thank you, Ingo. You still have a time for us. We know that this is Weihnachten weather, isn't it? But you still give us some of your time. Thank you so much for that. And we can only give you this certificate. Say thank you. We hope that you are in good healthy also. Germany in general also. But now you moved to Hohenheim, but we miss Göttingen.
Yes.
Some of us are from Göttingen.
So, I miss it too. Thank you so much. It has been a real honor and a real pleasure to be with you today. And actually, I hope that the next talk I'll be giving, I can give this actually in person in Indonesia again. So very much forward to that opportunity. If you allow me again to give a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Terima kasih untuk semua partisipan, untuk dosen-dosen, ada Bu Yeni, Pak Dadan, ada Pak Giato, Bu Evi, dan banyak lagi. Nggak bisa disebut. Oh, Bu Upi, tadi saya lihat dari Jambi ya.
Yeah, Bu Dami, Prof Dami. I'm still here.
Okay, Bu Upi is from Jambi, Professor Ingo. So she came all the way.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof.
Okay,
Ingo.
thank you so much for
nice
coming.
presentation.
Ingo, thank you for the wonderful presentation, Ingo.
Bye.
Terima kasih Bu Bapak.
Terima kasih Bu Evi.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih ya Bu Evi, Bu Hagia semuanya.
Terima kasih Bu.
Take good care. Bye bye.
Bye. Sudah Weihnachten. Thank you Ingo.
Izin live ya Bu.
Oke. Terima kasih. Oh ya, kami akan melakukan survei. We will have a small survey for the attendance of our guest lecture. Ingo, this is our 6th lecture from abroad.
Wow.
So 6th one. So we will have a little bit a questionnaire for our guests from everywhere, from all our alumni, also from our colleagues in every place, and Yeah, if you have a question from Africa, it's our postgraduate student actually.
Ah,
Yeah,
cool.
from
Yeah, pretty
Tanzania.
amazing. Yes.
Yeah, actually he must go to Indonesia, but still in country because of COVID-19.